For the medical segment today, I'm going to address an extremely timely question from a longtime listener and new Patreon supporter of the podcast, Kath Carpenter. Kath wrote to me wondering about whether or not there have been any updated guidelines on safe return to training and racing after being infected with COVID-19, and specifically with the Omicron variant. I say that this is a timely question, partly because here in the United States, we are very likely right at the crest of the Omicron wave as I'm recording this, and infections, I hope, are soon to begin decreasing, but leaving in its wake millions who've been newly infected, and many of those will be interested in the answer to this because they're triathletes. It's also timely because if you heard the last episode of this program, then you know that I am one of those who is so afflicted. I had COVID for the first time almost 3 weeks ago now, and despite being double vaccinated and boosted, was pretty sick for a few days there. I've pretty much completely recovered now and gotten back to training, but even though I am pretty up to date on the medical literature on this issue, I found myself a little unsure on how to proceed once I felt better and ready to get back on my bike. Of course, the reason for all the uncertainty about this question is the rare but still very real danger of post-COVID myocarditis. Last year, I covered this subject in episode 49, but at the time, that was a pretty newly observed phenomenon. And in the intervening time, I wondered if anything new had been discovered about how often this entity is seen, how much of a concern it should be in people who are not hospitalized with COVID, and whether or not vaccination confers any special protections. Well, to discuss all of this and to give an overview of some institution-specific guidelines, I've invited back to the podcast my friend and colleague, Dr. Spencer Tomberg. Spencer joined me way back in episode 9 to talk about the REDS, or Relative Energy Deficiency Syndrome, and I've asked him back again now because he surveyed the medical literature in order to develop return-to-play guidelines for Denver Health, the hospital that we both work at here in Colorado. Welcome back to the TriDoc Podcast, Spencer.
All right, Jeff, thanks for having me here. It's good to be back and to discuss this topic that is a really good question, and I'm not sure we have the full data, but we can discuss everything that we have out there to try to get a little clarity on this.
Yeah, I find we very rarely have all of the answers, but we do our best with what information we have. First, Spencer, just before we get into this, give us a little detail on who you are, what your background is, and what gives you the expertise to answer this question.
Sure. So I'm an emergency medicine physician, and then I did a sports medicine fellowship afterwards, and then I returned to work at Denver Health in the emergency department, and I also work in the orthopedic clinic. So I try to kind of bridge my interests of all the medicine that's behind being an emergency medicine physician with the sports medicine background as well too. And so one of the questions that we had at Denver Health was we take care of, especially at the beginning, it was kids. And we take care of a lot of kids who were getting COVID, and how are we going to return them to play and do that in a way that was reasonable so that we weren't taking away their opportunity to be athletic, but also safe for them moving forward. So I worked with our cardiologists at Denver Health, our pediatric cardiologists, and our infectious disease doctors to put together some guidelines to help guide people in the institution to return their patients to play.
And again, the reason this is so important is this notion of myocarditis. And I looked at the guidelines that you developed. I have what you sent me. Thank you for that. And it's actually interesting because it's pretty much the exact same table that was taken from the paper that I discussed a year and a half ago around now. So I gather there's really been nothing new on that front. Nothing has come out, no new studies of surveillance studies or anything like that.
There hasn't been a lot that's come out that's changed in the first year since we looked at. There was a study that came out of that looked at professional sports leagues kind of across the table. And what they did is they looked at all their athletes who were diagnosed with COVID, and then what they really have there in the professional leagues is they have set medical protocols. So the NFL's protocols that I was looking at last night are if you have mild disease or have like a little cough for a couple of days, no fever, or you don't feel bad at all, then you can basically return to play without much of a clearance. But if you have fever for 2 days or more, at that point you're getting a pretty extensive medical workup, including a visit to the doc, EKG and troponins, and then maybe echo based off that. So those are things that most athletes and most people in society just don't have access to if they're sick for 2 days. In those cohorts, they found that about the numbers exactly were 3.8% of their athletes ended up needing further cardiac testing if they met that protocol, if they were put into the higher risk protocol based off the length of their symptoms. So, 3.8% is a decent amount. And then those athletes went on to have further testing. Most of them ended up having cardiac MRI, and only 2 of the cohort, which was 0.3%, ended up having confirmed pericarditis. So, that is 3
pericarditis, not pericarditis.
That was confirmed. Yes, sorry. Let me go. So it's 2 athletes had confirmed pericarditis. 3 athletes had confirmed myocarditis. So there were both areas of inflammation on the pericardium and in the myocardium off that study. But that was showing that it is not something that's seen a lot, but it's not totally zero in the professional sports leagues. And that's probably where we have the best data from right now, because they have the most robust screening protocols.
So just to break this down and put it into plain English, we're talking about a large group of professional athletes who had COVID, who probably had pretty mild disease. I mean, we're assuming Aaron Rodgers isn't one of them because he's unvaccinated. Yeah. We won't go there. And they come back after this, and their protocol says if you've had disease for longer than how many days was it, you said?
The NFL specifically was 2 days, and I don't know the specifics of this. Was the NBA, the Major League Soccer, MLB, which is baseball, National Hockey League, and then NFL. So all I know specifically is NFL. The NFL was 2 days of symptoms.
Wow. So, I mean, everybody's going to, unless you were completely asymptomatic, everybody's going to have at least 2 days of symptoms. So basically they're testing everybody, which, as you said, is not going to happen in the population. Yeah. But when they tested everybody, 3% of them had abnormal echocardiograms, then went on to have MRIs, and a very tiny fraction, 1/10 of those people, ended up having some inflammation either in the pericardium, which is not dangerous, or the myocardium, which is potentially dangerous. The question then is, how dangerous is it? And that's the thing we don't know. So you're talking about, that's what we don't know. So we're talking 3 people who had myocardial inflammation out of the initial cohort that we don't know what that number was, but it's it's less than 0.5%.
The initial cohort was 780 odd.
Okay. So 3 people out of 780. Okay. Right. So 3 out of 780 had myocardial inflammation after having pretty mild disease. So we're talking about a small number, but it's not zero. The other question is, how big a risk is it? Would it have been if those people had gone back and done something? We don't know. Now, we of course know the high profile, case reports of people who had sudden death from this. So it does exist. It is a potential risk. We just don't know. And so much of this is based on the unknown. And that's why these protocols are so conservative. And I'm looking at the protocol that comes again from that paper that goes back almost a year and a half now.
Can I add one other piece in there? Kind of stratification. So there was a study that came out of Circulation, and it was in I'll give you the date here in a minute, but they looked at the total number of sudden cardiac deaths that they could find over a 20 or 30 year span, which ended up during athletic competition. So they found that there were 1,049 deaths that could be related to a cardiovascular cause. And of those, myocarditis accounted for 41 of the 1,000 of them. So that, if you look at everybody that plays sports in over 20 or 30 years, that we have 1,000 sudden cardiac deaths is actually pretty small. But of those athletes that died, about 4% of those were related to myocarditis. So I'm not sure how that translates, but that also is not insignificant when we look at the number of people of how that relates to people who die from cardiac causes during sports.
Well, it's not insignificant, and it's more important when you consider that we know that COVID affects the heart. That's the issue here, is that we know that COVID affects the heart. Certainly, we know that the more significant your disease is, for example, those who are hospitalized, those who have the need for a ventilator, those who are, having very significant disease, those people have a much higher risk. Again, we don't know exactly how high, but we know it's more than 3 out of 780. Those patients have a much higher risk.
When they've looked at that, it's about 1 in 5. So about 1 in 5 patients, hospitalized patients, have been found to have had some myocardial involvement when they've looked at that.
Right. So I think we need to think, okay, and it comes back to what I asked before, which is, do we know if the vaccine confers any protection? And I think we don't know if the vaccine protects your heart, but we do know that the vaccine protects against severe illness. So you're taking your risk of myocardial involvement from 1 in 5, because severe illness is associated with a 1 in 5. So you're taking your risk of severe myocarditis from 1 in 5 down to this, probably 0.3%. So that's a pretty impressive reason, again, to get vaccinated. And something that I think most people listening to this program can take as reassuring. If you have been vaccinated, if you have been boosted, if you then ended up getting Omicron, as so many people are, then waiting until you've healed, waiting until you've gotten over that illness, you can be somewhat reassured that the likelihood that you've had myocarditis develop out of that is going to be very low. That doesn't mean it's zero, but it's going to be very low. So you can at least feel comfortable about that. So that's a good thing. Then we need to consider, okay, so I think also, before we continue with just these protocols, which are really, really focused on the heart, we also have to consider how much pulmonary involvement there is, because even in mild disease, I mean, you and I both had it. We both were coughing quite a bit. And that puts a damper on how much you're able to do in terms of, exerting yourself and doing endurance sport. And these protocols don't even take that into account, because I think, at least in my conversations with people, if you have pulmonary involvement, you're just not going to be able to exert yourself anyways. Is that kind of where you've come down on this?
I actually haven't looked specifically at the pulmonary involvement. I know that I played hockey last night, and it was 2 weeks after I was kind of cleared to get back out, and it did not, I can skate and get around, but it didn't feel quite the same yet. So I'm sure that there's some lingering effects that I've seen kind of personally. And I think that they're probably more self-limiting of performance, but if you have pulmonary and other things going on too, those are going to kind of build on top of each other. So I think we have to consider that as well.
Yeah, it's interesting, speaking from the personal perspective, I think it's fair to say that while you have COVID, while you're having symptoms, not only do you not feel like doing anything, you really shouldn't be doing anything.
Right,
let's just give your body time to heal. Don't do it. It's funny. I was talking with somebody yesterday who said, "Oh, I had COVID. I was really mild disease. I was out running. I had a great 5K." And I was like, "Oh my gosh, you may feel great, but maybe take it easy." So anybody listening, if you're in the throes of COVID, even if you have mild symptoms, please give yourself a few days of not exerting yourself, because you may feel fine, but your lungs and your heart are definitely undergoing some kind of illness, even though you may not be exhibiting terrible symptoms. So we know that all the guidelines say give yourself 5 to 10 days of not doing anything. And then let's just look at your algorithm. Then it really comes down to how sick were you, right? In terms of what you should do next, for specifically considering whether or not you should get cardiac testing. And this goes back again to this paper that I talked about a year and a half ago. If you were hospitalized, honestly, I'm not even going to get into the nitty gritty. If you were hospitalized, you should not be going back to activity unless you get some kind of testing. So we're just going to leave that out for now, because that's not really who we're talking to. I think who we're talking to in this segment is people who did not require hospitalization, either because they were vaccinated and so they didn't get sick, or if they were unvaccinated, they just were fortunate and didn't have a significant case. So then we need to break it into these 3 categories. You have asymptomatic, mild symptoms, and moderate symptoms, and take us down those different pathways.
Yeah. So I think the trick in all of this is that they're not defined by the societies. So there is asymptomatic. Actually, that is defined. You did it. That's very well defined. Yeah. You don't have any symptoms, you're asymptomatic. At that point, after you clear your CDC guideline, after you clear the recommendation, the recommended time from the CDC of the infectious control period, you can gradually return to activity. Now, there was a study out of the NCAA that looked at athletes who were asymptomatic and actually found I can pull it up. I have it on another screen, but actually found a reasonable amount of possible myocardial involvement in those asymptomatic college athletes. But it begged the question of, these were really high-level athletes who were training at a high level. They didn't have any control groups. So they saw some changes in the heart, but they weren't able to say, oh, that was actually not due to their training, but that was actually due to COVID that caused it. So most of the guidelines that I've seen that have gone through have really pushed more towards asymptomatic. There's not a lot of bang for the buck in terms of testing from there. So, the NFL clears those patients, and so do the recommendations of our cardiology colleagues. So the trick here is the mild or moderate symptoms. So mild symptoms in the NFL language, which is not on this, is you have a cough, you don't have a fever greater than 104 degrees for 2 days. You feel just a little bad. That's who they group into the mild symptom category. Those people, again, can be put into the 5-day kind of make sure you don't get anybody sick protocol, and then a slow return to activity after that. The moderate symptoms, where it is not defined here, and we can talk a little bit about, I know we're not talking about pediatrics, but the pediatrics actually guides that as less than 4 days of symptoms. I think I would be a little more careful with adults and put them where the NFL is doing it on the 2 days of symptoms there. But it's not clearly defined how long you have to have symptoms for. If you're in that moderate group, then we want you to see your doctor to get cleared. And that clearance includes EKG and a troponin, plus minus an echocardiogram. So what we found is, I think it depends what system you're in, right? Like if you're in a system that has a ton of resources, they might be able to get everybody that comes through the door an EKG, a troponin, and an echocardiogram within 2 days and get people back on their feet and moving again. Our system can't get echocardiograms for people that quickly. So we really need to work more on physical exam, exactly how their symptoms are, make sure there's no big changes on the EKG. The EKG is a little bit tricky because it's only, I can't remember the exact number, but it's in like the 40 to 50% range of being sensitive for picking up any changes due to myocarditis. So you could have myocarditis and still have a normal EKG. So that's why we couple it with the troponin, which is going to show us if there's any actual strain of the heart for that. And then in our system, if either of those are abnormal, then we get them in for an echocardiogram. And then
I need to interrupt for a second because looking through all of this, these are extremely conservative, and I get it. I understand. Yes. Did you do that? Did you go get a cardiogram and a troponin?
No.
Okay, neither did I. I had symptoms for more than 2 days. I know you did as well. So based on what you're saying, both of us should have gotten a cardiogram and a troponin. Neither of us did.
Neither of us did. But here's what I think is actually really important. And we talked about this the other day. Then I'll let you break it. I think the people that are listening to your podcast are going to be people that are going to want to push themselves. And it's hard. I think the hardest thing about this is, do you have people that will actually listen to their body when their body tells them to stop? And so the next page down has some recommendations on a return to play protocol. And this is what I use to grade myself to get back to activity. Is I'm going to start off at a lower level. I'm going to do that for a short amount of time. I'm going to make sure I'm okay with that. I'm going to push a little bit harder. I'm going to push a little bit harder. I'm going to give myself 4 or 5 days to make sure that I'm back up to the level where I can really perform before I'm going to give myself permission to move faster. Now, I think the real question is, if you have high-level athletes who are training at a significant level, will they listen to themselves, and will they tell themselves that they're actually not feeling good and give themselves permission to be seen by a physician when they need to? That would be my biggest concern.
So I think that this page, and I will get this page I will link to this page in the show notes somehow. Is this page available on the Denver Health website? It is? Okay. So
where it is it's actually based off of BJSM recommendations, which is the British Journal of Sports Medicine. So okay. I can get you those recommendations. All right.
So we'll have the link to this in the show notes. And I would urge everybody to take a look at this because this protocol to me makes a lot more sense. The only thing about this protocol that I didn't love and that I was going to mention was stage 5, earliest day 21. I felt like
We
that
did
was
not change
pushing
the
it a
dates.
little bit. Yeah.
We didn't change I guess changing the dates. That was when there was a 10-day self-isolation period. And
Right.
then you had 11 days to kind of work back up. That will come down with once CDC guidelines are on.
Got it. So just to explain what I'm referring to. So Spencer's done a great job of explaining what this looks like. And I will say that I did this. I didn't know about this, but I did this just naturally. And this is how I would advise people to do. And anybody listening to this, I would strongly encourage, if you know somebody, if you've gone through COVID, if you're going through it right now, you should take a look at this. And basically what it talks about is just a very gradual, give yourself time to get through the illness and then very gradually returning to your training. I spoke to my coach because I know myself, like Spencer made the reference to athletes who are going to push themselves and aren't going to listen to their bodies, guilty as charged. So I told my coach, I said, look, I'm going to need a solid week of low intensity training. And so that's what he scheduled me for. He scheduled me for low volume, low intensity, and we ramped it up very slowly over the week. And by the end of the week, I was feeling pretty good. And I told him, you know what, I felt pretty good. Let's increase it over the next week and see how it goes. And I gave feedback over every single day. And by the end of week 2, I was just about back up to normal. And the thing that I was referring to in this as being overly conservative is that on this particular protocol, it says that you are back to normal training progression by day 21. And that's where Spencer agrees it needs to be reduced a little bit. And I think by day 14 to 17, I think would probably make more sense just based on my own personal experience. Although I have spoken to other people who have told me that they've needed 21 days. So I think there's going to be a range there, but the key, and you hit the nail on the head. The key is you have to be ready to listen to your body and you have to be ready to seek help. And, when I looked before starting this conversation, I again, went to see if there's anything new, and it's all the same stuff. Listen to your body. Any unexplained chest pain, any unexplained fatigue, or more shortness of breath at exertion than you would expect, you need to reach out to a healthcare provider to get checked, to get that cardiogram, to get that troponin, and possibly an echo after that. And so, I think this makes a lot of sense, this advancing protocol, and I think this is what I would definitely tell people to follow as they come back from illness. And it's what, like I said, I did. And feel like worked for me, and I bet would work for most people. And it's what you're recommending as well.
I mean, that's what I did for myself. I can say say that. And, I think I think it makes a lot of sense to do it this way, and it felt natural in terms of where I'm at, especially if you can listen to yourself and do that. The last caveat I'd put on it are there's specific recommendations. If you're over 65, you have pre-existing cardiac or pulmonary issues, then that is a different game. You just you see your doc, you have a conversation with them, you get a little bit of testing because your risks are going to be much higher of having.
Absolutely. And thank you for bringing that up, because I think, you and I, I'm older than you are, but I'm still in an older group where probably not that high risk, but still a higher risk. And yes, we need to remember that you and I are not representative of everyone, and that there are going to be people who have higher risks and they have to take those seriously. But for the majority of people listening who are going to be baseline healthy, generally, in good condition coming into this, they need to follow a gradual progression return, but be very attuned to their own body. If you're over 65, if you have any underlying health issues, especially cardiac issues, no matter what your age, then you need to definitely check with your doctor before returning to training. So I 100% agree with that. I think that's excellent advice. And thank you for reminding me. Well, how did you find it? And I'm curious because you're an active guy, in your experience and talking to others who've gone through this, do you think that being active and fit gave you some kind of, not protection, but I don't know, resiliency to this in any way?
I think it gives resiliency across the board. And, I think one of the interesting things about putting this process together, this is about how we created this, was talking to Steve Federico, who's our head of pediatrics at Denver Health. And he realized that this was all based off expert opinion and that it was very conservative. And his big concern was about the mental health of our kids when we were doing this. And I think that's the other thing to recognize, is that being active is a big part of a lot of people's mental health, and that we need to balance our conservative medical care with our an equally conservative amount of being concerned about mental health. And so that's why we really work to get kids, especially if we can do it safely, to get them back and playing again, where we're not holding them out for extended periods of time. And it's the same for me. Like, if I'm held out for an extended period of time of doing what I love doing, it makes me grumpy, and it does not improve my life. And so I think that, it probably built resilience through the disease, but it also rebuilds resilience through my life in general. So I talked around that a lot, but
I think that finishing comment is the most important thing, because I agree with you. I think it does build resilience into your life. And I found for myself, it's hard for me to compare, right? Because I mean, I'm an N of one. I felt like that first week coming back after COVID was exceptionally difficult. I found every I didn't swim right away. So I was diagnosed. I think I was out of the pool for a total of about 12 to 14 days before I went back to swimming. My first swim back wasn't too bad, although I couldn't really swim as hard as I wanted to. My first runs and bikes for the first week that I was back running and biking, everyone was an effort. Like, none of them were, I didn't have any chest pain or palpitations or anything, but I just found them harder to do than I would have expected. And then after the first week of training, I was finally starting to feel better, and cardiovascularly, I felt like things were coming around. But then I felt like my muscles were just tired, and more tired than they should have been for missing a week of training. So that was interesting. And now finally, after a full, I think it's now 2.5 weeks, I finally feel like I'm back on track, and everything's back where it should be. So it was an interesting process, certainly much worse than, any kind of respiratory illness I've had before. And I hope this is helpful for people listening who either are going through this or, are going to come across it, because let's face it, Omicron's cutting a swath through everyone. Right. Any final comments before we finish up here?
Oh, thanks for having me on. I appreciate it. It's good to talk about this.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks again, Spencer, for being here. And I'm sure that there will be other topics when we'll have you back in the future.
Sounds great.